Hello, listeners. This is Thomas Dykes.
And Randall Hinton.
And we're pleased to present this Flashpoint podcast of the 17th Amendment, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. Well, the 17th Amendment is a very important topic, I think, and we've seen that the 17th Amendment has caused a certain amount of constipation for the U.S. Constitution. And tonight we aim to show how that's the case. And so, Randall, as far as the 17th Amendment is concerned, how many people do you think know about the 17th Amendment?
How many people do I think know what the 17th Amendment is?
Yeah, give me a percentage, or in your daily life, how many people actually know about this amendment to the Constitution?
I think if we have 5% of the populace that knows what the 17th Amendment is, that we're guessing pretty high. I mean, I don't think there's very many people who even know what it is, much less understand what it did.
I think you're an optimist with that estimate, but I think you make a good point. The point is, this is something that's critical, and it's probably not well known. And so we're going to explore that tonight. We hope that the listeners enjoy this conversation because this does impact. Now, you'll notice the title of this podcast is Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. Well, we're going to talk about why that's the case. So we hope that's interesting to you and that will encourage you to listen on. But the 17th Amendment, Randall, let's go backwards in time and talk about the original intent of the Founding Fathers. They created the Constitution. So tell me, Randall, what was the original intent of the Constitution before the 17th Amendment?
Well, you know, before the 17th Amendment, you had the Constitution talked about the fact that you had the popular election of your state representatives, and then that your senators were appointed by the state legislature. And there wasn't necessarily a provision that said this is how the state legislature will choose it. It left it up to the states to figure out exactly how they chose it, but they were then appointed by the state legislatures.
Now, do you mind if I just interject, Randall? I'll read the actual language from Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution as it was originally written. It says in Section 3 that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. Okay, that's the same. But here's the kicker. Chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years. So as you said, in the language of the Constitution, the legislatures of the state were supposed to choose their U.S. senators. What's the significance of that?
Well, the founders, they obviously, in setting up the Constitution, were organizing a set of checks and balances, or a separation of the powers. They didn't want, they just experienced very tyrannical government, and they were trying to the best of their ability to establish a strong central government that did not allow the power to consolidate and destroy the freedom of the people. And so they had this separation of powers, these checks and balances. One was the people, and that was in the House of Representatives. The people directly elected the representatives that went to the House. And then another sovereign body that was represented were the states. And that's what the Senate was set up for, so that you had the individuals electing these representatives that had only a 2-year term, and, you know, it was very short. Issues got hot, you know, things got really, you know, inflamed in the Congress, you know, in the House of Representatives. And so they would debate over these issues that were now at hand, and they would send a bill through to the Senate, and the Senate, having appointed representatives representing the states, would look at the legislation, and they would take their time to consider whether or not that was a valid point, whether or not it really needed to be dealt with right now. Now, if it did, they could act on it. But if it didn't, as was the case with most legislation, it was shot down. Now, why was that important?
Well, imagine that, the Senate being well, I heard it called a safety vehicle or a safety valve for the states' rights against the central government's tyranny. So the Senate used to function as a way to slow everything down, which would be to the chagrin of our government formation nowadays. But back then, that was seen as a good thing, right? As a check and a balance against the other half of the House, or the House of Representatives.
Totally.
Well, let me just share a couple quotes. Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, he said, and I quote, "Election of senators by legislatures was an absolute safeguard." I think Alexander Hamilton knew a little bit about it since he helped set it up. Another founding father named George Mason, who was the author of the Virginia Bill of Rights, this was a model for the Bill of Rights in our U.S. Constitution. So this guy was pretty smart. He wrote something that Thomas Jefferson and others modeled the Bill of Rights after. So George Mason says, quote, "The election of senators by legislatures gives the states some means of defending themselves against encroachments by the national government." I have a lot of other quotes, but it was clear that when the founding fathers set it up, they believed quite obviously that the state legislature should pick the U.S. senators, those 2 senators from every state. And so I tend to side up with them, since they kind of knew a little bit about government, that they felt that it was critical that the state legislatures pick these senators.
Well, now, Thomas, you got to understand, though, after that time, we had a couple key events that happened. Probably the first main one was the Civil War.
Right.
And prior to that time, everyone was, or most people were intensely, tied to their state. They didn't call themselves Americans. They called themselves, Bostonians from Massachusetts. They called themselves New Yorkers or Virginians or whatever. They related their local area to being who they were rather than being Americans. So then after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, a lot of that was removed from the thought of the people because, in fact, we just fought a war because there were all these states who thought they could leave the Union, and then we had to fight a war about it.
I saw this special on HBO about John Adams, and they did a really good job examining his life. But he took this case where he defended some British soldiers, and he won that case. But I remember at the end of that case, when they were cleared, they were found not guilty, he made a quote about he made a comment about his state. He said essentially, "Massachusetts is my country." Now, have we ever called, I'm from Utah, I've never called Utah my country. But back then, the founders and people in general looked at their states as the original colonies, 13 individual countries essentially, or states, nation states essentially. And so I found that fascinating in that documentary, is he called his state his country. And certainly that's a different perspective of states' rights or the sovereignty of states than what senators or Americans nowadays think in general about their state.
So what did the 17th Amendment change then? We've talked about what it was, or what the original intent of the founders was, some of the history that led up to it. What was the ultimate straw that broke the camel's back, Thomas?
Well, in general, Americans changed. You had some momentum come into the country that wasn't there when the country was founded. Now let me just reemphasize the fact that the founding fathers, who studied government their whole lives, they came out from the tyranny and oppression of the king and of the monarchy of England. They studied ancient civilizations. So yeah, I'm backtracking a little, but the point is these were incredibly enlightened individuals.